The town of Brook Haven lay nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oaks. It was a place where life moved at a gentle pace, where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, and children's laughter rang out like music on summer afternoons. 16-year-old Jake Turner had grown up in this town, learning every winding path, every creaky porch, and every familiar face. Brook Haven had its share of struggles, but its heart was its people, the kind of people who came together when it mattered most. It was a breezy June afternoon, and Jake walked home from school, savoring the warmth of the sun on his skin. His birthday was just 2 days away, and anticipation bubbled within him. He had saved up for weeks, doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, and now he finally had enough to treat himself and his friends to a night at the arcade. The crumpled bills and jingling coins in his pocket were more than money, they were freedom, joy, and hours of carefree laughter waiting to happen. But as Jake rounded the corner of Elm Street, his excitement dimmed. He slowed his pace, eyes drawn to the small, white house at the end of the street. The house belonged to Mr. Benson, an elderly widower who had once been known for crafting intricate wooden toys and furniture. For years, Mr. Benson had been a fixture in the community, sitting on his porch with a whittling knife in hand, offering gruff but kind words to anyone who passed by. But lately the porch had been empty. Whispers spread through town about Mr. Benson's illness, about how he was alone and fading. Jake hesitated, torn by an impulse he couldn't ignore. His mother's words came back to him: true kindness isn't about grand gestures, Jake. It's about showing up when it matters most. He had heard it many times, but now the words seemed to carry weight he'd never fully understood. He reached into his pocket, feeling the money he'd worked so hard to save. An inner battle raged within him, but it was over as quickly as it began. Jake walked up the cracked steps and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet house, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open. Mr. Benson stood in the dim light, leaning heavily on a cane. His face was gaunt, and his eyes, once sharp and bright, were clouded with exhaustion. Jake Turner, Mr. Benson rasped, his voice a mix of surprise and weariness. Yes, sir, Jake said, swallowing the lump in his throat. I wanted to see how you were doing. If you need anything. For a moment, Mr. Benson stared at him, as if trying to determine whether this was some cruel joke. Then, slowly, he nodded and stepped aside. The house was dim and smelled faintly of musty books and medicine. Dust covered the furniture, and faded photos lined the walls, capturing moments of joy from a past that felt distant. Jake followed Mr. Benson into the living room, where the older man lowered himself into an armchair with a wince of pain. They sat in awkward silence until Jake cleared his throat. Can I help with anything? Groceries, repairs, maybe? Mr. Benson let out a dry laugh that turned into a cough. Help, huh? I don't need charity, boy. It's not charity, Jake said quickly. Just neighborly help. Mr. Benson's eyes softened, though his expression remained wary. Suit yourself. Over the next few days, Jake found himself returning to Mr. Benson's house. He cleaned out the gutters, mowed the overgrown lawn, and fixed a leaking pipe in the kitchen. Each day brought small changes, brief smiles, quiet nods of thanks, and eventually stories. Mr. Benson spoke of his late wife, Margaret, whose laughter had once filled the house, and of the workshop out back where he'd crafted toys for children. He spoke of good times and hardtaches, of hope lost and found. Jake listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with questions that drew out the memories. He had always thought of Mr. Benson as just the grumpy old man on the corner. Now, he saw him for what he was, a man shaped by love and loss. On the morning of Jake's 17th birthday, he woke to sunshine streaming through his window. His friends were already making plans for the evening, and the thought of the arcade lit a spark of excitement. But as he gathered his things, his eyes fell on the worn envelope that held his birthday money. He picked it up, feeling its weight in his hands. For a long time he stared out the window, lost in thought. Finally, with a deep breath, He slipped the envelope into his pocket and made his way back to Elm Street. Mr. Benson was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm air. He looked up as Jake approached, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Didn't expect to see you today," he said, his voice rough but touched with something close to warmth. Jake sat beside him, the wood creaking under his weight. I brought something for you." He pulled out the envelope and placed it on the small table. "It's my birthday money. I want you to use it for medicine, groceries, whatever you need." Silence stretched between them. Mr. Benson's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope, staring at it as if it were something fragile and precious. "Why?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do this?" "Because no one should have to go through this alone," Jake said softly. "You matter, Mr. Benson." The older man's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. Then, with great effort, he reached out and clasped Jake's hand. They sat like that, two souls connected by a simple act of compassion, as the world moved around them. That day, Jake stayed with Mr. Benson, tending to small tasks, sharing stories, and listening to the old man's memories. It wasn't the birthday celebration he had planned, but it was one he would remember for the rest of his life. The laughter of his friends at the arcade faded in comparison to the quiet moments of connection he shared with Mr. Benson. For the first time, Jake understood the true value of what he had given, and what he had received in return. As the weeks passed, Jake continued to visit Mr. Benson. There were good days when they laughed over stories of the past, and hard days when pain and fear stole the words from Mr. Benson's lips. Jake was there for all of it, offering what he could: a steady hand, a listening ear, a reminder that he wasn't alone. And in the moments when doubt crept in, when Jake questioned whether he was making any difference at all, he would see the light return to Mr. Benson's eyes, if only for a moment, and know that it was worth it. Autumn came, painting the trees in fiery hues. One evening, as leaves rustled in the wind outside, Mr. Benson called Jake to his bedside. His voice was weak, his breath shallow, but his gaze was steady. "Thank you, Jake," he whispered. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost hope." Jake's throat tightened. "You don't have to thank me," he said, fighting back tears. "I'm just glad I could be here." Mr. Benson nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Promise me you'll keep living with that heart of yours. The world needs it." "I promise," Jake said, his voice shaking. The older man closed his eyes, his hand resting in Jake's. Moments later, the room grew quiet, and Jake knew he was gone. He stayed there for a long time, holding Mr. Benson's hand and letting the weight of loss settle over him. It was a pain unlike any he had known, but it was tempered by the knowledge that he had made a difference, that his small act of kindness had meant something. The days that followed were hard. The people of Brook Haven came together to honor Mr. Benson's memory, and Jake spoke at the service, sharing stories of a man who had once been more than just a lonely figure on a porch. He spoke of resilience, of hope, of the bonds that form when we reach out to each other. And as he stood among the mourners, he felt the weight of both grief and gratitude, a reminder that kindness, even when given freely, leaves lasting marks on those who receive it. Jake carried those lessons with him as he moved forward, determined to honor the promise he had made. Life would not be easy, but he knew now that it was not about grand gestures or fleeting moments of glory. It was about showing up, day after day, for those who needed it most. And in that simple, unwavering commitment, he found a purpose that would guide him for years to come. In the months following Mr. Benson's passing, Jake Turner felt the weight of both loss and newfound resolve. Each visit to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Brook Haven reminded him of the promise he'd made to live with the same heart that had connected him to Mr. Benson. Jake poured himself into keeping that promise. His senior year of high school became a blur of classes, part-time jobs, and quiet acts of kindness that few ever noticed. Whether it was fixing a neighbor's fence, tutoring a struggling classmate, or volunteering at the local food bank, Jake found solace in service. It was his way of honoring the bond he had shared with Mr. Benson. But life was far from easy. Jake's parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, and any thoughts of attending college seemed distant. They were proud of him of the way he had stepped up in the wake of Mr. Benson's death, but Jake knew the weight of their unspoken worries. Money was tight, and every cent counted. He picked up extra shifts at a local grocery store, stocking shelves and bagging groceries late into the night. Exhaustion became a familiar companion, but he refused to let it slow him down. One rainy evening, as Jake trudged home after a long shift, he passed by the familiar house on Elm Street. The new owners had moved in a few months earlier, and the house now boasted a fresh coat of paint and flower boxes under the windows. Yet for Jake, it would always hold memories of quiet conversations, shared meals, and moments of connection that had changed his life forever. He paused, letting the rain wash over him, and whispered a quiet thank you to the empty porch. The following weeks brought new challenges. Jake's mother fell ill, and hospital visits became a part of their routine. The medical bills piled up quickly, and the stress weighed heavily on the family. Jake spent countless nights at her bedside, holding her hand and telling her stories to keep her spirits up. He could see the worry in her eyes, the way she tried to mask her pain for his sake. It reminded him of Mr. Benson's stubborn pride, and it filled him with a mix of sorrow and determination. He would do whatever it took to support her, even if it meant sacrificing his own dreams. One day, while taking a rare break in the back room of the grocery store, Jake overheard a conversation between two of his co-workers, a married couple, who had emigrated to Brook Haven years earlier. They spoke in hushed tones about their struggles to make rent and the fear of being evicted. Their words struck a chord deep within him. He knew what it felt like to be on the edge, to carry burdens too heavy to bear alone. Without a second thought, Jake approached them and offered the small amount of money he had been saving for his mother's prescriptions. "Take it," he insisted when they tried to refuse. "I know what it's like to need a little help." Tears filled their eyes, and the couple thanked him repeatedly. Jake walked away with a heavy heart, knowing that the sacrifice would make things even harder for his family. But he also felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness could light the way. Over time, word of Jake's quiet generosity began to spread through Brook Haven. Neighbors who once knew him as the boy who helped Mr. Benson now saw him as a young man willing to stand by anyone in need. His friends admired him, even if they didn't always understand why he worked so hard or gave so much of himself. One evening, as they gathered around a fire pit in a friend's backyard, someone asked, "Why do you do it, Jake? You barely have enough for yourself." Jake stared into the flames, the warmth dancing across his face. "Because it matters," he said simply. "It mattered to Mr. Benson. It matters to my mom. And it matters to me." The conversation shifted, but Jake's words lingered in the air. For the first time, he saw the flicker of understanding in their eyes, the realization that kindness wasn't about convenience or recognition. It was about showing up when it was hardest, when the world felt heavy and hope seemed out of reach. As high school graduation approached, Jake's future remained uncertain. College acceptance letters arrived, but the cost was daunting. He considered taking a gap year to save money, but the thought of delaying his dreams was disheartening. One afternoon, as he helped clean up after a community event, he was approached by Ms. Ramirez, a local teacher who had always supported him. She handed him an envelope with trembling hands. "What's this?" Jake asked, confused. "Open it," she said, her voice soft. Inside was a scholarship offer, funded by donations from the people of Brook Haven. The letter explained that it was meant to support students who had given selflessly to their community, students like Jake. Overwhelmed, he looked up at Ms. Ramirez, who was already wiping tears from her eyes. "This town believes in you, Jake," she said. "Just like you've believed in all of us." Jake accepted the scholarship with humility and gratitude. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was a start. As he prepared to leave for a nearby state college, he promised himself that he would continue living by the values that had shaped him. He would honor Mr. Benson's legacy and his own mother's sacrifices by building a future rooted in compassion. College brought new experiences and challenges. Jake balanced his coursework with part-time jobs and volunteer work, often sacrificing sleep to make ends meet. He joined student organizations focused on community service, helping to organize food drives, tutoring programs, and mentorship initiatives. He became known on campus as someone who would drop everything to lend a hand. His reputation as a leader and a compassionate advocate grew, but Jake never sought the spotlight. He was content to work quietly, to build connections and create opportunities for others. One chilly autumn evening, as Jake walked back to his dorm after a long day, he received a phone call that changed everything. His mother's health had taken a turn for the worse. He rushed home, spending every moment by her side, but despite their best efforts, she passed away in the early hours of a winter morning. Grief hit Jake like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in sorrow and regret. He felt the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every goodbye left unsaid. In the weeks that followed, Jake withdrew from everything. He went through the motions of daily life, but the spark that had once driven him was gone. Friends reached out, but he pushed them away, unable to bear the weight of their concern. It was only when he found himself standing at his mother's grave, the wind biting at his skin, that he remembered Mr. Benson's final words: "Promise me you'll keep living with that heart." Slowly, Jake began to heal. He returned to college, throwing himself into his studies and his work with renewed purpose. He realized that the best way to honor those he had lost was to continue living with compassion to give, even when it hurt, and to find hope in the connections that bound people together. His efforts caught the attention of local organizations and philanthropists, leading to new opportunities to expand his reach. He worked tirelessly, but this time he allowed others to support him as well. It was a lesson he had learned through loss that even the strongest among us need help. One evening, as he walked through campus, a letter arrived for Jake. The envelope was thick, and the return address was unfamiliar. He opened it slowly, his heart pounding as he read the words inside regarding the estate of Mr. Clarence Benson. Confusion and curiosity filled him. Why now? What could it mean? The letter requested his presence at the reading of Mr. Benson's will. Jake prepared himself for whatever awaited him, knowing that this was another chapter in a story that had begun with a simple knock on a door. Whatever the outcome, he would face it with the same heart that had guided him for so long, the heart that had connected him to Mr. Benson and to the community he loved. The crisp morning air was filled with the sound of footsteps echoing against the marble floor of the law office. Jake Turner walked with measured steps, his mind racing with questions about what the reading of Mr. Benson's will could possibly mean. It had been more than a decade since Mr. Benson's passing, but the memories were as vivid as ever: the warmth of shared moments, the quiet strength of a bond forged through compassion. Jake never expected anything in return for the time he spent with Mr. Benson, and the thought that his name might still be tied to the man's final wishes was both humbling and bewildering. The receptionist led Jake to a private conference room, where a handful of people were already seated. He recognized none of them, but they seemed to know each other, their quiet murmurs hinting at a shared history. At the head of the table sat Mr. Harding, an older man with a kind yet serious expression. He gestured for Jake to take a seat, and once everyone was settled, he began. "Thank you all for coming today," Mr. Harding said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "We are here to honor the wishes of Mr. Clarence Benson, a man who, as some of you know, lived a far more complex life than he allowed most to see." Jake leaned forward, a knot forming in his stomach. Complex? In all their time together, Mr. Benson had rarely spoken of wealth or influence. He had been a craftsman, a storyteller, a man haunted by grief and loneliness but wealthy. The thought seemed incongruous. Mr. Harding continued, his words painting a picture of a life Jake had never fully understood. Mr. Benson, it turned out, had once been a highly successful carpenter whose handcrafted furniture graced the homes of the wealthy. He and his late wife, Margaret, had lived modestly despite their growing fortune, and after her death, Mr. Benson withdrew from public life. He invested wisely, turning a small sum into a considerable estate, but he never spent it. Instead, he lived simply, seeking solace in his work and his memories. Mr. Benson was a man of hidden means, Mr. Harding said, his gaze settling on Jake. And in his final years he found solace in an unexpected friendship. The other attendees turned to Jake, curiosity and, perhaps, a hint of envy flickering in their eyes. Jake shifted uncomfortably. He had never sought to be anyone's savior, he had simply done what felt right. Mr. Harding cleared his throat and continued, detailing Mr. Benson's wishes. A portion of the estate was allocated to various local charities, including the hospital and community services that had supported him. Smaller bequests were made to old friends, neighbors, and organizations that mattered to him. Then, Mr. Harding's tone softened. To Jake Turner, he said, his voice clear but reverent, Mr. Benson left a specific inheritance. Jake held his breath as Mr. Harding continued. He left you a sum of $1 million. Gasps rippled through the room. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. $1 million? The number seemed unreal, a figure that existed in dreams, not in the life of someone who had spent years scraping by. He barely registered the stunned whispers around him as Mr. Harding pressed on. But more than that, Mr. Harding added, he left you a letter and a personal request. The executor handed Jake a sealed envelope, the paper worn with age. Jake's hands trembled as he took it. He barely heard the rest of the will's contents, his mind racing. The meeting concluded shortly after, and the attendees filed out, each with their own thoughts and speculations. Jake stayed behind, staring at the envelope, as if it contained answers to every question he had ever asked. Finding a quiet spot in a nearby park, Jake sat on a bench beneath a canopy of trees. He turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of its significance. Finally, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. Mr. Benson's familiar, looping handwriting filled the page. Dear Jake, it began. If you are reading this, then I am long gone, and the truth of my life has come to light. I suspect you never imagined the extent of my means or my reasons for hiding them. To you, I was simply an old man in need, and that is why I chose you. You showed me kindness without expectation, compassion without judgment. In my darkest days, you reminded me that life still held meaning, even when it seemed lost. I leave you this inheritance not as a reward, but as a tool. You have always understood the power of small acts to create change, but now you will have the means to create something lasting. Use it to build the world you believe in, a world where people care for one another, where kindness is more than a fleeting gesture. I trust you, Jake, to do what is right. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for reminding me of hope. Live with that same heart, always. With gratitude and affection. Clarence Benson. Tears blurred Jake's vision as he read the letter again and again. The weight of Mr. Benson's faith in him was overwhelming. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it against his chest as he closed his eyes. This was more than an inheritance, it was a calling. A challenge to continue living with compassion and purpose. But the path forward was not without obstacles. As word spread of Jake's sudden wealth, he became a magnet for attention. People he barely knew sought favors, while others whispered behind his back. Some accused him of exploiting Mr. Benson, questioning his motives and integrity. At first, the criticism stung deeply, reopening wounds he thought had healed. But with time, Jake learned to stand firm. He knew who he was and why Mr. Benson had trusted him. The opinions of those who did not know him could not change that. He decided to put the money to use in ways that honored Mr. Benson's legacy. His first project was the creation of a community center in Brook Haven, a place where people of all ages could come together, find support, and build meaningful connections. The center offered after-school programs, job training, mental health resources, and more. Jake worked tirelessly alongside volunteers, pouring his heart into every detail. It was not just about spending money, it was about creating something that would outlast him, something that would reflect the values he had learned from Mr. Benson. The center's opening day was a moment of both triumph and vulnerability. As people gathered to celebrate, Jake stood before them, his voice steady but his heart pounding. "This is not just a building," he said. "It's a promise that we are here for each other. That no one in this community has to walk alone. I know what it's like to feel lost, to need a hand when the world feels heavy. This place is for all of us." The applause that followed was genuine. But so too were the challenges that lay ahead. Running the center required constant effort, from fundraising to managing programs. There were days when Jake felt stretched thin, when the weight of expectations threatened to crush him. He faced resistance from skeptics, criticism from those who believed he was wasting Mr. Benson's money, and setbacks that tested his resolve. But through it all, he drew strength from the memory of Mr. Benson's words and the faces of those he was helping. Among the skeptics was Caleb Ward, a businessman with deep pockets and a vision for Brook Haven that did not align with Jake's. Caleb saw the land on which the community center stood as prime real estate for development and opportunity to build luxury housing that would change the character of the town. When Jake refused to sell, Caleb launched a smear campaign, painting him as an idealist squandering his inheritance. The attacks were relentless, and at times they shook Jake's confidence. But he refused to back down. One evening, after a particularly heated town hall meeting, Jake returned to the community center feeling defeated. He found himself alone in the quiet hall, the weight of the day pressing down on him. As he sat in the dark, lost in thought, he heard footsteps. Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly woman he had once helped at the grocery store, stepped into the room. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice soft but strong. "Don't let him take this from us, Jake. You've given us hope. You've given us a place to belong." Her words were a lifeline. Jake looked at her, seeing not just one person but an entire community that believed in what he was trying to do. He stood, his resolve hardening. "I won't," he promised. With renewed determination, Jake fought back. He rallied the community, sharing stories of lives transformed by the center. People from all walks of life came forward, their voices joining together to drown out the negativity. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Caleb's campaign lost momentum, and the center's mission was defended not just by Jake, but by the very people it served. In the years that followed, Jake continued to expand his efforts. He established scholarships for underprivileged youth, funded medical care for those in need, and partnered with organizations to create sustainable change. Each project was a reflection of the promise he had made to live with the same heart that had touched Mr. Benson's life. There were struggles and triumphs, moments of doubt and moments of joy. But through it all, Jake never lost sight of why he had started. One day, as he walked through the community center, now bustling with activity, he paused by a framed copy of Mr. Benson's letter. He traced the words with his fingers, feeling their weight and their hope. "Thank you, Mr. Benson," he whispered. "For everything." Jake knew that the story was far from over. There would always be more work to do, more people to help, more lives to touch. But he was ready. He had come full circle from a boy who gave what little he had to an old man in need, to a man determined to give everything he could. And as long as he had breath, he would keep that promise. The years continued to pass, and Jake Turner remained unwavering in his commitment to build a community rooted in compassion and kindness. Under his leadership, the Brook Haven Community Center grew from a modest initiative into a thriving hub that touched thousands of lives. The center became a symbol of resilience and hope, a place where no one was forgotten, where everyone had a chance to find belonging. Programs flourished, from workshops that provided job skills and mental health counseling to youth mentorship and art classes. Every success story reminded Jake of why he started and strengthened his resolve to keep going. But as the impact of his work grew, so too did the challenges. Balancing the demands of managing a large organization, fundraising, and meeting the needs of the community often felt like an insurmountable task. Jake's days were long and filled with meetings, phone calls, and the ever-present worry of sustaining the mission. Yet, amidst the chaos, he never lost sight of what mattered most: connecting with people. On a cool spring afternoon, Jake walked through the community center, stopping to chat with familiar faces. A young woman named Mia approached him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know if you remember me, but you helped me when I was a kid. My family was struggling, and we came here for food and support. You talked to me about my dreams, and, well, I'm graduating college next month. I just wanted to say thank you." Tears filled Jake's eyes as he hugged her. Moments like this were a testament to the power of kindness, to the ripple effects of a simple decision made years ago to help a sick neighbor. It wasn't the $1 million or the notoriety that mattered, it was the lives changed, the hope restored. As Jake grew older, he began to reflect more on the legacy he would leave behind. He wanted to ensure that the values instilled in him by Mr. Benson would continue to shape Brook Haven long after he was gone. With the help of dedicated staff and volunteers, he established a foundation that would support the community center and its programs in perpetuity. The foundation's mission was clear: to uplift, empower, and connect. One day, as he reviewed documents in his office, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Mr. Harding, the retired lawyer who had overseen the reading of Mr. Benson's will. Though older and frailer, he still carried himself with dignity and warmth. Jake welcomed him with a smile, offering him a seat. "I've been hearing about everything you've accomplished," Mr. Harding said, his voice filled with admiration. "I wanted to see it for myself. Clarence would be proud." "Thank you," Jake replied, feeling the weight of the compliment. "But it's not just me. So many people have come together to make this possible." Mr. Harding nodded. "That's true. But you were the spark." The two men spoke for hours, reminiscing about Mr. Benson and reflecting on how far things had come. Before leaving, Mr. Harding handed Jake a small box. "Clarence left this with me," he explained. "He said it was for you when the time was right." Jake opened the box after Mr. Harding departed. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden compass, its craftsmanship exquisite. A small note accompanied it to guide you. As you guided me, Jake traced the compass's intricate details, feeling a swell of emotion. It was a reminder of the journey they had shared, the paths that had crossed, and the purpose that had driven him all these years. Life in Brook Haven continued, with its triumphs and tribulations. Jake faced setbacks, moments of doubt, and even personal losses. But through it all, he remained true to his promise. He surrounded himself with people who shared his vision: mentors, allies, and friends who believed in the power of community. Together, they weathered every storm. One of the greatest challenges came when a major economic downturn threatened to shutter the community center. Funding dried up, donations dwindled, and the need for services only grew. Jake worked tirelessly to keep the doors open, but the strain took its toll. Late one night, as he sat alone in his office, staring at spreadsheets that refused to balance, he felt the weight of exhaustion. Was it enough? Had he given all he could? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Hargrove, now even more frail but still fiercely determined. "I heard you were struggling," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "We've been through hard times before, Jake. We'll get through this too." She placed a jar on his desk filled with coins and small bills. "It's from the people," she said simply. "They believe in what you've built." Word spread quickly, and within days, donations began to pour in, not just from Brook Haven, but from people across the state who had been touched by the center's work. Corporations stepped forward, inspired by stories of hope and resilience. Jake realized that the community he had worked so hard to lift up was now lifting him in return. Together, they weathered the storm. As the years passed, Jake began to focus more on mentorship, guiding a new generation of leaders to carry on the mission. He took joy in watching young people grow into compassionate advocates, creating ripples of kindness that extended far beyond Brook Haven. The community center expanded, opening branches in neighboring towns and reaching even more people. It was everything Jake and Mr. Benson had dreamed of and more. One evening, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and members of the community he had dedicated his life to, Jake stood in front of a gathering at the community center's 30th anniversary celebration. He spoke of the journey that had brought them all together, the moments of doubt and triumph, the people who had come and gone, and the enduring power of compassion. He spoke of Mr. Benson, of a promise made and kept, and of the countless lives changed by a single act of kindness. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and laughter filled the air, Jake found himself alone in the quiet of the center. He walked through the halls, pausing by the framed copy of Mr. Benson's letter. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling the presence of his old friend. "I hope I made you proud." The years continued to pass, and Jake's hair turned gray. He slowed down, but his heart remained as strong as ever. He spent his final days surrounded by the people he loved and the legacy he had built, a legacy born of compassion, resilience, and the simple act of giving without expectation. When Jake passed, the community mourned deeply but celebrated the life of a man who had changed so many. They carried forward his mission, living with the same heart and purpose that had guided him. And in the quiet corners of Brook Haven, where children played and neighbors helped one another, the spirit of Jake Turner and the simple gift he had given to a sick neighbor so many years ago lived on. The compass he had cherished was passed on to a new generation of leaders, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could light a path through the darkest times. And in the hearts of those he touched, the story of Jake Turner and Mr. Benson continued to inspire, reminding all who heard it that true wealth lay not in what we had, but in what we gave.